Sarah woke up early, even before the first weak light of dawn began to break through the window. The room reigned with the usual silence, violated only by rare sounds from neighboring apartments. Muffled clapping of the doors, the light noise of the awakening city. At such moments, she especially clearly felt the fragility of her life, as if this quietest moment was a respite to a long day, filled with deeds, obligations, and attempts to keep everything under control. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, looking thoughtfully out the window, where streetlights flickered. In her mind, thoughts of how its existence has changed again over the past year, not so long ago. The hope that a divorce from Andrew would be a temporary difficulty that could be overcome, preserving at least the illusion of a complete family. But reality was different. Divorce became the point of reference of a new life in which stability has acquired special significance. Sarah seemed to live on a thin line, where each step required maximum caution. She still remained the head of the department in a large company, skillfully coping with his duties that demanded not only professionalism, but also mental resistance. Outwardly, she seemed assembled and confident, but deep down she often felt tension and fatigue, which accumulated day after day. A divorce from Andrew, a man with whom she spent the best years of her life, did not become a sharp gap, rather, a quiet, cautious divorce, dictated by the desire to maintain a sense of safety and balance for their son Liam. It was a kind of contract, an agreement in which two adults found a way to remain parents, despite the fact that their personal roads dispersed. Family life turned into a schedule separated between the two houses, the house of Sarah and Andrew's house. Every week, Liam spent part of the time with his mother, part with her dad, and between them tried to maintain not too intrusive contact so as not to create a child's sensation of bifurcation. Andrew still played an active role in leaving Liam. Despite the break, he remained a caring father, which was an important and at the same time difficult moment for Sarah. She knew that she could not raise her son alone and accepted this reality with gratitude, but at the same time with a constant internal tension associated with the fact that she had to keep everything under control. Control not only her life, but also the emotional well-being of the child. Sarah wanted to maintain stability at all costs. For herself, for Liam, for the fragile sense of the family that still remained between them with Andrew. There was something almost desperate in this desire, because she understood that any breakdown could lead to unpredictable consequences. Stability seemed to her not just comfort, but the only island of security in the raging sea of changes and uncertainty. She was afraid of mistakes, was afraid that one careless phrase or a decision could destroy everything that he and Andrew managed to save. Every morning it began with the preparation of Liam for school, careful selection of clothes, breakfast, and checks so that nothing was forgotten. Sarah controlled the schedule of lessons, meetings, extracurricular activities, trying to create a sense of order and security for her son. At this time, thoughts often returned to how her own way of life changed. Now there was no place for spontaneity, for relaxation, for those little things that used to seem natural and insignificant. Everything was subordinated to the care of stability, and it sometimes seemed a heavy burden that she carried without the right to weakness. Her work in the company became not only a source of income, but also a kind of anchor, which makes it possible to focus on tasks, distract from personal problems, find the strength to move on. Sarah knew how to maintain professionalism, not allowing personal experiences to influence decision-making. But this required great efforts. Colleagues saw in her a strong and confident leader, not suspecting how difficult it is sometimes to just come home and meet with what was left after the divorce. The agreements with Andrew included not only the division of time with Liam, but also the issues of joint education, financial support, participation in school events. Despite the gap, they managed to maintain a working relationship, although restrained, without unnecessary emotions. Sarah understood that their joint task was to do everything possible so that Liam would not feel discord and would not become a hostage to an adult drama. A quiet voice lived inside her, which every day reminded that for the sake of her son, it was worth withstanding everything: pain, fatigue, and uncertainty. At times, Sarah caught herself thinking that her own desires and needs faded into the background. She was used to putting the interests of her son and work above everything else, pushing her own happiness into the background. This was not selflessness in the classical sense. Rather, it was a necessity caused by circumstances and an internal sense of responsibility. Her heart was filled with contradictions. On the one hand, she dreamed of calm and harmony. On the other hand, she realized that stability is a fragile structure that should be protected and protected daily. When Liam was going to school, Sarah always led him to the door, trying to put it in every kiss, and a hug is not only warm, but also confidence that there is a place where they love and wait for him. Her eyes often lingered in a boy who, with childhood spontaneity and at the same time seriously looked at the world, trying to understand how the life of adults was arranged. For Sarah, this was both pain and a source of power. She wanted to be the support that Liam could always find, despite all the changes and difficulties. At this quiet morning hour, Sarah still did not know that the coming day would bring new trials that would make her look at her life from a different angle and revise her ideas about the family, responsibility, and personal freedom. But at these minutes, she only had to hold on to what it was, for that tiny but precious stability that she built a brick behind a brick in order to preserve the world for herself and for her son. When Sarah looked back at her childhood, it seemed to her that their family had two completely different realities, intersecting only in the framework of the common space and the common parental house. Kate's younger sister, like a bright, but at the same time annoying contrast, has always been in the center of attention of parents, like a golden child, from which they had the least and which they forgave a lot. Her image, carefree, successful, albeit with noticeable cracks under the surface, more than once forced Sarah to experience complex feelings, from envy to powerlessness, from misunderstanding to irritation. Kate seemed to be the embodiment of what Sarah could never achieve: unconditional love and family support without additional conditions, without constant need to prove her value. Kate and her husband, Michael, from the very beginning of life, have found themselves in a difficult financial situation, which was only aggravated every year. They dreamed of their own business, the possibility of getting out of the vicious circle of constant debts and uncertainty. But the reality was harsh and required not only optimism, but also real resources, which they did not have. Michael, a man with a difficult character and far from always stable behavior, often became a source of conflicts, and Kate, despite his ambitions and confidence, looked vulnerable and even confused at such moments. This created an additional voltage between sisters, since Sarah increasingly became the person to whom Kate asked for help. Continuous calls, messages, and visits with requests to lend money have long turned into the usual background of relations between them. But the matter was not only in financial assistance. Kate seemed to deliberately remind Sarah that her divorce is a failure that she still cannot survive, that her life is not as successful and stable as it would seem. In conversations and even random remarks, caustic notes of comparison sounded. "You are still one and we are together. Maybe you should reconsider your priorities. If you were as successful as we..." These words remained a heavy burden on Sarah's soul. The idealization of Kate of her own family was especially painful, which actually hid many problems, but which she preferred not to notice, so as not to ruin the image of the ideal. Sarah understood that Kate had her fears and failures, that her requests for money was an attempt to stay afloat. But the constant pressure and the feeling that she was used gradually became unbearable. The money that she borrowed rarely returned, and attempts to discuss this turned into accusations and quarrels, after which there was only silence and chill in a relationship. Every time Sarah said no, in response she heard not just disappointment, but a real aggression that was not in the family before. It was not just a conflict, it was a battle for respect and recognition, which, it seemed, was impossible to win. At heart, Sarah tried to understand her sister, her fears, aspirations, and weakness, and at the same time desperately wanted to protect herself and her family from constant pressure and emotional exhaustion. In their relationships, there was no place for lightness or trust. Instead, distrust, misunderstanding, and resentment, accumulating for years, reigned. Sometimes it seemed that every word, every look carries in itself a hidden injection that could hurt deeper than an open conflict. Between them, there was a wall that could not be circumvented, only with efforts and large internal costs to break through it. Kate often reminded that Sarah should be stronger, cope with life, that divorce is not a sentence, and that she herself is to blame for her unhappy situation. These words sounded not so much as tips, but as reproaches, which Sarah perceived as injustice, because she knew how much her strength and pain invested in building a new life for herself and Liam. But, despite all this, it was in moments when Sarah was on the verge. The sister's voice sounded loudly, destroying the last remnants of internal balance and forcing to doubt herself. These relations became for Sarah one of the most difficult trials, where not only family debts and mutual obligations were intertwined, but also deep emotional wounds, accumulated over the years of misunderstanding and unresolved conflicts. It seemed that there was only cold and misunderstanding between them, and attempts to get closer more and more ended in new quarrels and disappointments. And in this endless cycle of demanding requests, offensive reproaches, and a quiet pain, Sarah tried to stay on her feet so as not to lose the most important thing: her inner calm and the opportunity to take care of her son without unnecessary cargo which a family drama brought with him. The house of parents has long ceased to be just a meeting place, the usual corner of childhood, where you could forget about external problems and plunge into the warmth of family comfort. Instead, it turned into a kind of stress range, where every word and every action became the reason for the experiences and worries that pulled Sarah down, like heavy chains. The loss of the father's work, which happened unexpectedly and irrevocably, brought down the financial instability to parents, which extended to all spheres of their life, including an emotional state, because inaction and a sense of helplessness sometimes turned out to be much heavier than the most monetary need. Mother's disease is weak and tired. She increasingly needed support and care, which laid down another heavy load on Sarah's shoulders, forcing her to feel at the same time as a daughter, an assistant, and the only stronghold of the family. Every week, Sarah brought money to her parents, not just as material assistance, but as if trying to catch the gaping holes that appeared in their common life. She knew that these funds often did not go to the most necessary things, but rather to maintain the illusion of the previous standard of living, for attempts to maintain external stability, which had not been for a long time. All these are constant spending on medicines, minor repairs in the house, utilities, sometimes on products that parents could not always afford, formed in a huge financial load, which exhausted Sarah no less than emotionally. She often felt the feeling that she had become a kind of family ATM, whose resources are inexhaustible without regard to and gratitude. Sarah understood that the support of her parents was a duty, a tribute to respect and gratitude for everything that they did for her in the past. But every day this feeling more and more turned into an unbearable duty that squeezed out of her strength and did not leave space for her personal life. Her own budget barely coped with numerous expenses related to Liam education, payment of housing, and necessary to maintain the working pace with trifles. A constant sense of deficiency, a shortage of time, money, calm, accumulated and turned into a quiet but stable fatigue that Sarah could not afford to show even close people. Communication with parents increasingly took place in the shadow of omissions and light tension, which sometimes poured into small quarrels and resentments. Parents, although they did not accuse directly, nevertheless expected from Sarah more involvement, more understanding, and large sacrifices. They looked at her through the eyes of those who once put all their love and hopes in the child, and now, being in a difficult situation, they demanded an answer and support. Sarah felt that this expectation was becoming an unbearable load that presses on her more and more every day. And the more she tried to help, the clearer it became that the abyss between generations and between realities was becoming wider. The emotional atmosphere in the family gradually worsened. Instead of support and mutual understanding, which once seemed natural and unshakable, now fatigue, disappointment, and silent reproaches reigned. Parents, in a state of chronic anxiety and uncertainty, often showed irritability, which unpredictably passed into reproaches and even accusations. Sarah, in turn, increasingly felt like a rescuer who was forced to sacrifice her own well-being for other people's problems. Her inner world was filled with contradictions. On the one hand, she could not abandon the help of her parents. On the other hand, she felt how she began to lose herself, plunging into an endless circle of family obligations from which it seemed that there was no way out. Each request of the parents became a new stage of tension, which Sarah was forced to overcome in order to preserve at least some stability and order in her life. A quiet but stable anxiety grew inside it. Anxiety for the future, for itself, for Liam, for the fact that if you don't stop now, it may be too late tomorrow. She understood that this load is not only financial, but also emotional, psychological, and that without serious changes, it would be increasingly difficult for her to maintain her mental balance. Nevertheless, every time Sarah was going to put the border, say no, or try to distance herself, a feeling of guilt rolled on her, deep and painful, like a heavy stone that could not be discarded. After all, these were her parents, people who gave her life, raised and loved no matter what. And this paradox, between the desire to free itself and a sense of responsibility, created in her soul an unbearable struggle, from which she could not find rest, even in the quietest and calmest moments. Sarah increasingly caught herself thinking that in this family drama she lost part of herself, that ease and inner freedom, which once seemed natural and unshakable. Her world was compressed under the weight of debts, obligations, and painful expectations, and a sense of own value became more and more unsteady and unstable. And in this silence, filled with unenviable words and restrained tears, she tried to find strength to live on, not only for herself, but also for the sake of her son, for the sake of the tiny hope that still remained alive inside her. The evening of a family dinner with parents always seemed to Sarah a necessary ritual, despite all his unpredictability and often a painful emotional intensity that always accompanied these meetings. This evening, like many previous ones, began with visible silence, Quiet greetings, cautious smiles, timid attempts to maintain a conversation about weather or everyday trifles. But behind this surface, a thin grid of tension was hidden. With every hour, there was only stronger and stretched as a stretched string, ready at any moment to break from the slightest touch to pain and resentment. Kate and Michael came together, as usual, hand in hand, as if trying to demonstrate the unity and power of her family. Although Sarah knew that the anxieties and failures that they tried in vain were hiding behind this facade. Kate, as always, was on top, smiling, confident, with a light note of arrogance which was barely noticeable, but noticeable to everyone present. She spoke the first, without preface and thoughts, immediately declaring her new business idea, a food for the Philippine cuisine, which, according to her, was to become their great and successful project. The idea seemed to be inspiring, but its implementation required serious investments. Investments that, of course, Kate and Michael asked Sarah. This request sounded like a thunder in the middle of a clear sky. Sarah sat at the table, peering into familiar faces, trying to understand how it was. Just a few minutes ago, they talked about the weather, about the children, and now this request, so unexpected, and as it seemed to her, unhealthy. Kate's words were firmly, as if she had already decided the fate of this project, and did not perceive refusal as a possible option. Michael, restrained and silent until that moment, only nodded in confirmation silently. His gaze seemed complete to weight and pressure. Sarah felt something inside, as if a cold hand grabbed the throat. She understood that it would not be easy to refuse. This would mean not only to refuse support, but also to open a new crack in an already shaky relationship. But the mind told her firmly and clearly. Now, when she herself experienced financial pressure, which pulled her down, one cannot afford such a luxury as a large and risky investment that is unlikely to justify. She tried to explain this as calmly as possible, giving arguments that you could first consult with specialists, make a business plan, carefully weigh the risks and opportunities. But these words were perceived as distrust, as an encroachment on their plans and dreams. In response to her refusal, the conflict flared up, at first quiet and tense, then turning into open accusations. Kate, usually restrained and even soft, suddenly flashed with anger. Her voice trembled with emotions, and the words sounded sharply. She accused Sarah of egoism, that she does not want to help the family, that she is too fixed on her stability and does not understand what it means to maintain loved ones in difficult times. Michael, supporting his wife, interrupted and strengthened her accusations, adding that Sarah is more and more moved away from the family and becomes cold and indifferent. Sarah tried to remain calm, but she felt a wave of irritation and resentment growing inside. She understood that this dispute is not just about money, but about much deeper and more painful things, about misunderstanding, about expectations, about long accumulated grievances and disappointments. The words of Kate and Michael sounded like blows, each of which left a new bruise in her soul. Her refusal was perceived not just as a refusal, but as a betrayal. The refusal to be part of the common family. The refusal to support what was supposed to be a link between them. The situation was heating up to the limit, until finally, the last, as it seemed, was the indictment of Kate. And the whole family, as if under the pressure of this explosion of emotions, left the house of the parents in irritation and resentment. Sarah was left alone at the table, feeling the bitterness and emptiness that spilled over her soul and made them doubt the correctness of her decisions. At this moment, It was difficult for her to understand where the debt to the family ends and her own right to calm and security begins. She knew that this was only the beginning of a new stage in their relationship, in which there would be even more complex conversations and possibly even more painful conflicts. But now, sitting in silence after the departure of relatives, Sarah, for the first time in a long time, felt how much she was tired of constant tension, from constant struggle for respect and understanding. This struggle was just beginning, and it foreshadowed the long and difficult path, which would have to be followed to find her own harmony and preserve what is really important to it: life, free from the eternal sense of guilt and excessive obligations. After that tense family dinner, when it seemed that the gaps between them had become deeper and more noticeable, the days and weeks brought with them not relief, but rather an increase in tension, which penetrated into the smallest details of the life of Sarah and its encirclement, as if dense fog, not allowing even the nearest horizon. Messages and calls from Kate became increasingly persistent and at the same time painful. In each of them, a mixture of disappointment, resentment, and attempts to manipulate, which, like invisible strings, pulled Sarah for the thinnest emotional threads felt. The phone called at the most unexpected moments: at work, when she tried to focus on difficult projects; at home, when her fatigue weeded and wanted to rest. The sister's voice in the tube changed from excited and mournful to sharp and indictment, as if Kate tried to force Sarah to feel guilty of each no, for every attempt to defend his own boundaries. Sometimes the messages turned into real streams of words in which reproaches, accusations of selfishness, and indifference flashed. Hints that Sarah abandoned the whole family and betrayed them, that she became a stranger in the circle where everything was once different. Sarah's answers became more and more restrained and short, because she understood. Entering into a dialogue, she only adds oil into the fire, which flares up more and more. But silence and distance were perceived as cold and indifference, which only increased the anger of Kate and gave rise to new attempts to break through the walls that Sarah erected to protect herself. With each new contact, this invisible struggle became increasingly painful, exhausting the latest reserves of emotional forces and giving rise to a feeling of loneliness, which was especially acute in moments when she wanted to lean on her family. And instead, she came across alienation and misunderstanding. Understanding that the situation is out of control and begins to threaten not only her own calm, but also the well-being of her son, Sarah made a difficult decision: to block the contacts of the sister and parents in the phone and social networks. It was an act of despair and protection at the same time, an attempt to create a space in which one could stop feeling constant pressure and aggression, stop feeling the target of endless reproaches and accusations. But the blocking caused an even greater flurry of dissatisfaction from the family. Calls from other numbers, letters with threats and insults, attempts to hurt through common acquaintances, and even threats to destroy the subtle connection that still remained. Sarah closed in herself, avoiding not only contacts with his family, but also participation in family events, which previously seemed a natural and necessary way to maintain relations and maintain the illusion of unity. She understood that this gap was not just an emotional removal, but a deep split that would not allow to return to the previous state of things without serious work and possibly changes from both sides. Liam, observing all this, began to feel tension in the house. His children's heart absorbed the alarm and confusion of adults, and Sarah tried with all her might to create an atmosphere of safety and love for him, despite the fact that she herself increasingly felt lost and tired. This silence and detachment became a new reality, a reality where every look at the past was painted with pain, and each step into the future was accompanied by fear of possible consequences. Sarah realized that this conflict would not leave indifferent any of the parties, that the relationship that was once the foundation of her life has now become a source of pain and alienation, which would be difficult to heal without effort and recognition of their own mistakes and vulnerabilities. But at the same time, she understood that without tough boundaries and protecting her own psyche, her life could turn into an endless series of victims and disappointments. Sarah looked at Liam, playing in the next room, and tried to find the strength not only to withstand this difficult time, but also to learn how to build a new life. One in which she could not be just a daughter and sister, but primarily herself. A woman who has the right to her own feelings, to personal happiness and calm. And although the road forward seemed thorny and complete unknown, she knew that she would not have to walk along her alone. But at the same time, those who are really ready to go nearby, without reproaches and conditions, with understanding and respect. Thanksgiving, which for many was a reason to get together, recall what is really important, and divide warm moments, for Sarah turned into a difficult test for the strength of the connections that still remained, albeit at the limit of exhaustion and fatigue. The decision to go to parents with Liam was for her not so much the desire to return the lost as a necessity, the need to try to preserve at least a thin thread that connects it with the roots, with the past, with what formed it itself. She went there, realizing that she could face cold and hostility, but her inner voice persistently told her not to give up, not to allow bitterness and disappointments to become the final sentence of family relations. The house of the parents met them with a muffled light and the familiar smell of old things, a smell that usually brought warmth and a feeling of comfort. But that evening it seemed more like a ghost, a reminder that it was once, and that now it turned into a difficult, explained mixture of resentment and misunderstanding. The meeting began tensely, views filled with restrained discontent, light, detached words, as if all those present were at the limit of patience, trying to hide the disappointment and resentment in order to prevent them from escaping immediately and completely. Sarah felt the atmosphere shrink around her, and every step, each movement required maximum caution. Kate, unlike the rest, was especially sharp and aggressive. Her smile was stretched. Her eyes were cold and uncompromising. At one point, she destroyed the dish prepared for dinner, a symbolic and unpleasant action, which became a clear statement about her attitude to Sarah and her attempts to preserve the world. This act caused a wave of awkwardness and shock of the rest, but no one dared to intervene. The parents looked at the floor, avoiding confrontation, and Sarah stood as if chained to the place, feeling how everything collapses inside and scatters into small fragments of pain and resentment. The public insult that fell upon her and Liam became the climax of the evening. The words spoken by Kate were cutting, unfair, and ruthless, sounded loudly and clearly in the air, as if exposing all the early hidden conflicts and pains. Liam, a boy who only learns to understand the complex world of adults, felt the tension and pain that his mother was experiencing, and tears sparkled in his eyes. The first tears because he ran into an unpredictable and tough reality of family disagreements. Sarah tried to protect her son, but the power of emotions and resentments around was too great. And soon the parents, who did not show the slightest desire to stop the conflict, actually drove her and the child from the house. This outcome, so painful and unexpected, left a deep wound in Sarah's soul, a wound that lived and reminded itself with every memory, every touch to the past. Disappointment and a sense of betrayal overwhelmed her, like a cold stream that swept the whole body and soul. She stood on the threshold, peering into the dark windows of the parental house, feeling the earth collapsed under her feet, and at the same time struggled inside with the desire to leave forever, burning in a flame of pain and abandoning what was once called a family. But even at that moment, filled with bitterness and despair, there was an ankra of hope in the heart of Sarah. The hope that someday these wounds could heal, that time and efforts will be able to return lost confidence and warmth, that the family, despite all the trials and disappointments, will be able to again become a support that she so lacks in this complex and sometimes cruel world. And while this hope lived, she could not afford to abandon the struggle, could not close the door forever, even if she knew that the path to reconciliation would be long and thorny. Sarah and Liam gradually moved away from that gloomy and painful shadow that family drama left behind. In this process, a new space, a new family, although not connected by blood ties, but complete support and warmth, has become a kind of island of salvation for them, where one could breathe full chest and feel that life is still able to give not only trials, but also joy and peace. Andrew, with whom Sarah has long maintained friendly relations for the sake of a common son, became for her not just an ex-husband, but an important ally and support. A man who understood and accepted her difficult situation, not demanding in return for the impossible. Meetings with the family of Andrew, his parents, brothers, became for Sarah that rare light, who made his way through a thick veil of anxieties and doubts. Here she felt not just a woman trying to cope with life difficulties, but a man who is trusted, who is appreciated and supported. This support was not unconditional or easy. She demanded mutual respect and sincerity. But for Sarah, this was a real salvation and a return to herself. Together with Liam, they gradually built a new model of the family, where everyone took their place, and in which there was no place for past insults and irreconcilable conflicts. This new stage of life for Sarah meant, first of all, the adoption of a firm decision to stop that endless and exhausting financial support, which earlier eroded its personal boundaries and turned other people's problems hostage. This decision was not easy for her. It was accompanied by internal doubts, guilt, and fear of the reaction of her parents and sister. But an understanding of the need to care about himself and her son prevailed. Recalling countless conversations and scenes of reproaches, Sarah could no longer afford to be the source of means and support from which the forces pumped up, not noticing her fatigue and pain. The conversation with her mother on the phone was the last point, after which Sarah consciously set the boundaries, protecting her life from further destruction. There were no accusations in this conversation, rather, a quiet and firm statement of facts that could not be refuted or ignored. The mother, in turn, showed the whole depth of her disappointments and resentments that had accumulated over the years. But Sarah no longer listened to them as before. She heard, but did not take to heart, because she knew. These words would not change the past, and will not return it to the previous state. It was a conversation that completed one of the most painful stages of her life. After that, Sarah blocked the whole family, not only on social networks, but also in real life, trying to create a space around her free from constant pressure and expectations. This distance was both by liberation and the protection that she built for herself in order to maintain the remains of mental balance and prevent herself from drowning in a swamp of other people's problems. Sometimes, of course, there were shadows of doubts and pains, moments when I wanted to turn back and try again, but the inner strength and desire to build a new, healthy life still prevailed. In this new world, Sarah learned to put herself and Liam in the first place, not from selfishness, but from a deep understanding that this is the only way to maintain strength, love, and inner peace. She began to say no more often to those who are not ready to accept her borders, and yes, to those opportunities and people who brought her support and joy. This transformation had a lot of pain and losses, but even more, the discovery of new freedom, a new life, where the past no longer controlled its fate, but served only the lesson and support. Every day spent with Liam has become a holiday for a simple and present. Walks in the park, joint games, talking about small and big things. Moments when she could be just a mother, and not a woman fighting with an entire world. These moments filled her strength and helped to go forward, despite the fears and doubts, which of course from time to time visited her thoughts. And somewhere deep down, despite all the difficulties and disappointments, Sarah felt that there was a new stage ahead, a new chance for happiness, where she could not only survive, but live, love, and be truly free. After long months of struggle, testing, and internal changes, Sarah gradually rebuilt her life, slowly and confidently, withdrawing it from the captivity of old grievances, family obligations, and emotional overloads. The new stage, which she entered with Liam, was filled not only by difficulties, but also by amazing lightness, which arose from the awareness of her own strength and the right to happiness, to peace and to calm breathing in this stormy world. A meeting with a cousin, who suddenly appeared at the very right moment, became a symbol of support for Sarah, and a reminder that not all relatives are connected by the old load of mutual insults and requirements. There are those who can hear, understand, and help without conditions and reproaches. In a conversation with this relative, Sarah, for the first time in a long time, was able to openly share her experiences without fear of being incomprehensible or convicted. This dialogue became the starting point for the restructuring of not only external relations, but also the inner world, where doubts and anxiety previously reigned. New meanings and goals have now begun to break through. Sarah began to realize that putting herself and her son in the first place is not selfishness, but a necessary condition for maintaining health and mental balance, without which it is impossible to love or be a beloved. The emergence of a new support in Sarah's life allowed her to boldly make plans for the future, which included not only concern for Liam, but also the organization of regular meetings with other children, the search for opportunities for the development and socialization of her son. She began to devote more time to her own development, work, and personal interests, which previously had to sacrifice for the sake of family obligations and attempts to maintain a fragile world with her parents and sister. Now she learned to see herself not only as a mother and daughter, but also as an independent person with the right to happiness and inner freedom. In these changes, a deep transformation showed, not only in relation to the family, but also to itself. Sarah stopped seeing herself with a victim of circumstances and began to perceive her life as a path on which it is possible to choose what is important and what not, what relationship should be maintained and which let go. In this process, the willingness to accept mistakes, their own and strangers, as part of the inevitable experience, without which it is impossible to grow and move forward. The most important thing for Sarah is a feeling of relief that came with the adoption of itself and its new role. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cease to be afraid and worry about what could not control, and began to build life, based on what really brings joy and meaning. Her relationship with Liam became stronger, filled with trust and warmth, which were created not only by the efforts of the mother, but also with mutual discovery and acceptance. The new stage of life is not just the beginning, it is a conscious movement towards harmony, where the past does not determine the future, but serves only for the foundation for new achievements and happiness. Sarah learned to set personal boundaries and defend them, without feeling guilt, realized that taking care of herself is not a weakness, but strength. She gained the freedom that she dreamed about, to be herself, to love and live a full life. It was this that became the result of her long journey. The ability to let go of old grievances and bear responsibility for her own happiness, creating around him the family that does not destroy, but supports, does not press, but inspires. It was not just a new stage, but a new meaning that Sarah chose herself, and in which she found real liberation and hope for the future.